Right. So I want to talk a bit about today. How do we reach the goal without going crazy as developers? Uh,
Good
how
wisdom.
do we reach what the client wants when the client doesn't know what the client wants? How do we build when we don't have like precise things? So I've done a bit of a PowerPoint. Let me start that. Slideshow, presenting teams. Present. Oopsie. Let me just, okay, hopefully it'll start from the front. So we've done a lot of products for people, and, you know, we have one client who really is useless with specifications, and we've given up. So how do you deliver a product to someone like that? How do you deliver to somebody who really, you don't really know? If we think about our Power Integrator, we don't know the scenarios that we're going to encounter that app has to deal with. So how do we deliver that? So I've been thinking about this recently. Okay, so our good old spec-driven waterfall, the old school. We get some of the infrastructure or framework up, we get most of the features in, we test, we deliver, and then we realize we're nowhere near what we wanted. So that never worked, and it was, you know, it's okay if you're building a house, but not if you're building software.
Yeah.
Then developers, we jumped into Scrum. And, you know, we had a product owner, a backlog, and you worked through the backlog, and you refined the stories as you went along, you refined the UX as you went along. But the big thing is it required having a backlog.
Sure.
Quite frankly, often we don't have a very well-defined backlog, not in the work we do. We just don't. I mean, we think about the reporting app we built, and we really didn't have a decent backlog. We had an idea, and ultimately that was it.
Yeah.
We had an idea of what the guy wanted, and I was told build it. And like, how do you do that? How do you go from an idea to software without like wasting a huge amount of time? So like, do you just stop and say, well, if we've got no backlog, we can't do any development?
Right. Yeah. Time to get coffee.
Yeah. And, you know, do whatever we do. Do we just like kind of try? You know, how do you keep moving forward? How do you design without a detailed spec? And I think, you know, it's a difficult space for a lot of people to be in. Yeah, I mean, when I've been on projects that have very accurate spec, it's wonderful. But even then, it isn't what we want. So this is kind of what I've developed my own methodology, and you've seen it over the years of how I work. And so I thought we can talk a bit about this, and you can ask me questions and that. So we start here. And this is the idea. And then you ask yourself, where are we going? How can I build a framework that will achieve the goal, but that it's flexible enough to grow and adjust as we get closer to the goal?
Right.
Because there's a saying, you know, perfection is the enemy of good enough. And
yes.
And that is so true in software development. It's like, what is good enough at this point in the project that I can move a step forward?
Right.
What is the minimum I can do to go forward? So when we wanted to build Pi, we said, okay, well, we need a workflow engine. And it's like, okay, right? We just built a workflow engine. And that's all we did. And it didn't have to be perfect, didn't have to do everything. And
Right.
ultimately, over the 2 years, that workflow engine has grown a little, but it hasn't changed substantially.
Right. It laid a foundation that a lot of other things on top of it. Yeah.
Then once you've got a flexible framework, now you can build a dynamic UX. Now we can say, well, let's make the UX as configurable as possible based on the flexible framework.
Yeah.
So now we got two things that are very dynamic. They, in the beginning, it's a bit irritating because they're also very unstable.
Yes.
But
yes.
but it's having that insight to say, okay, like if we take the workflow engine again, if we want to build a new connector, we have a way of building it and registering it with the system that we don't have to change the UX.
Yeah.
There's very little UX. The workflow designer is dynamic in terms of that. We can go in, we can add a new node, and there's a prescribed way of doing it. We register it, the UX takes care of everything else. And that way the app can grow without it being an absolute nightmare. If we had gone back to waterfall and said, oh, we want these 20 nodes, and we had kind of hard-coded them all, and then node 21 comes along, we would have all thrown up our arms and go, oh, that's such a lot of work to go back and retest,
Yep.
And we're like, another node, oh, yeah, that's, it's a day. And we're fine. The design framework handles it, the editing framework handles it, the runner handles it. It's all been dynamically built because, quite honestly, we didn't have a clue what it was going to do at the end of the day, which basically means we built it to do anything.
Yeah, I'd sort of a bit of a view on what we had come across, but you're right, recognizing that was still even a small segment of what it could be used for. I agree. Yep.
It's done things we've just like, oh, wow,
Yeah. And often those things, I think this is why I like your spiral. Often it's like those things that are maybe the most innovative don't occur until maybe some of the first spirals occur. And you get into the building the verticals and something occurs to you because it's now concrete that you wouldn't have considered when it was still theory.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I've discovered is build vertical slices. This I learned from a previous boss, is like try and go from your back end through your API layer, database, API layer, into your UX, or up, have that whole pipeline working. One slice all the way through, because then you might realize certain things. It forces you to do authentication. It forces you to do other things that you would not have possibly thought of, and how your framework interacts all the way through early on. That's why I always try and get at least one slice working all the way up, and then it can inform you as you go down.
And what that's influenced me, watching you and learning that from you, because I had a tendency conceptually to separate them into client and server as if I was working on two separate systems. And sometimes that would bite me if I ran really far on the client, and then I had to go and implement something on the back end that, hadn't caught up with it.
Yeah.
And as you're saying, by just treating the whole thing as a system, you already have closed the gap that will help you in the future. Yep.
Yeah, and then I see it like fine-tune the framework. I really see it with the reporting app. I had to go back once I had it all the way through. I had to go back and look at performance issues. I had to go back and look at fine-tuning it, the framework itself.
Right.
And then I improved the UX to configure the framework. But from then on, a lot of it has been more about how do we configure that framework
Mm,
and how do we fine tune that configuration rather than building fine tuning the actual framework.
right. I mean, there might be slight tweaks but
Yeah,
as you say, if you design the framework flexible enough, those are really configurations anyway. So yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I've seen this with the reporting app. I see it everywhere. Is like, how do I make this thing configurable? How do I make this thing generic? How do I make this thing dynamic? Those are always questions that I ask myself, is like, can I put a framework in here to do this?
Right.
And that could be, multiple things. It could be, can I do some in place, allow some scripting? Can I allow dynamic, how can I configure a database? I mean, a simple thing is now the reporting app, we want to move one of the sections from a Mongo backend to a Postgres backend. But I had built the whole interaction. Sorry, I have a cat in the way. The whole interaction is a framework between the processing and the database. There is a layer there that an interface I can just take out Mongo, put in Postgres. But the actual rules engine that runs it hasn't a clue, does not know where the data is stored. It doesn't care.
It's getting it from a more generic provider.
Yeah. And if I had hard coded Mongo into the code base, that would be a disaster now. But if you encapsulate your layers and you build your frameworks and you build a set of providers, then changing from one database to another is not a problem.
Right. Yeah.
Because you can now extend your framework and then configure it. And I think, that's probably what I would put further in here. I didn't get the chance, but it's like we extend, then you extend the framework, and then you continue and you can configure and extend and configure and extend.
And there's a premise in here that I think is sort of underneath all of this idea that the requirements will always change. Because I'm just thinking about when I first started out, when I was thinking about building an app, the database, I just assumed naively it was a one-time question. Once you answer it, it fulfills your app requirements, and then boom, why solve ever having to change the database? Then that didn't make any sense. But now, having been in the real world, seeing so many factors on why you would change a database, right? Some of them are completely non-technical. It's the cost of the license or something, right? And all of a sudden, a naive solution becomes a nightmare. So that, again, your method here is based on this assumption that even the requirements you think are solid will possibly change.
And that is absolutely. I remember back, we always asked the question when we were interviewing people. It's like, you have a requirement that you must be able to run against SQL Server and Postgres. How would you design your code base to enable that?
Yeah.
And that question would stump so many people, because it's like, I've now got to, and I think the big thing here is how looking at your requirements and saying, if I get rid of all the noise, from an abstract point of view, what are we trying to achieve here?
Right. Yes.
I think that's the step that I haven't put down. It's like, if we had a look at the reporting app, I looked at it and I'm like, I abstracted it away to, they needed to do two things. They needed to split a record and filter data, and then split the record on the filtered data and do that multiple times. And that's basically what they need to do.
Yep.
But my code doesn't do that. I built a rules engine that does that. So now
Yeah.
the client can go and create as many different rules as they freaking want. It doesn't bother me. They can set it up however they want. We don't have to change the code.
So you
You know,
mean even different kinds of rules, meaning that like right now you might be, as you say, slicing things up and then slicing them up again, but in the future you might want to be grouping them instead of slicing them up. You might want to
absolutely.
consolidate them.
I took their rules engine into another product.
Hmm.
And I can't remember which one now, but it did completely different things.
Okay, yeah.
Same rules engine, same actions. Oh yeah, it runs the back end of Datatamer. Same rules engine,
Yes.
completely different scenario.
Hmm.
There we want to do take data, filter it, change the capitalization, or do data processing on that data. So I wrote new actions, boom, done, simply solved.
And again, because like to go back to what you said at the beginning here now, that the essentially what you were doing there in the rules were just taking some data, applying some sort of validation or transformation, and then outputting some data.
Yeah.
Almost like you boiled it down to its most basic transaction element.
You know, we were taught that every complex problem can be broken down into a set of simple, understandable steps.
That's right. Yep.
And the sooner you break that problem down into those understandable steps, then you can say, okay, how do I pragmatically do that step, that individual step? And then another side of it is, if I can do that individual step and I can put that in a library, I can unit test that step.
Yes. Yeah.
And then I can use that in the next step, which would be, kind of bigger, and I can unit test that. So all my frameworks are fully unit tested because they're independent, they're outside of the app, and they're completely 100% testable and reusable.
Yeah.
And so that just gives us so much, from a developer point of view. I know those things are rock solid. And I know I can throw whatever I want at them and it's never a problem. But if we had to have hard coded all those things, oh my gosh, you'll never get to unit test scenarios there. So, yeah. And then, so things like engines, the workflow, the rule state machines, like especially on the UX, it should really be in the UX. We've done that a number of times with complex UXs, state machines, but also factories and builders. So with the Power Integrator, when you drop something on the editor surface, we've got factories that build things. We've got all of that going on. The list down the side of the items is dynamically built. All our themes are dynamic and configurable. And boy, has that saved our ass so many times.
And also enabled features that like we didn't think about, right? Because of the theming one, for instance, when we had to integrate with one of the ERPs in their dashboard, we're able to sort of quickly pull in their values from their, in an iframe. And it's like we were never even thinking about it as an integration possibility when you built that framework. But because you built it in a framework way, you leveraged it.
And also we can, white label somebody's site in about 10 minutes.
Right. Make it really psychedelic too with a push of a button.
And I think a lot of developers don't see this. They don't see this way of developing. They see just, I have a set of requirements and I code to that set, and not, I need to abstract out, build a framework, and then let the framework solve the problem.
Yeah.
And then when a person comes along and then when there's a change, you're like, yeah, well, we just changed the configuration of the framework and we're good to go. And I suppose I started development with a product called SDT, a software training tool. And it used to capture a Windows app, capture a transaction, SAP, and others, and websites. And then you could, we had an editor, and then you could replay it, or you used to use it to train people on transactions. Still don't know why.
You mean it would capture like a screen share of it, or it would? Oh, okay.
We would do screenshots. Every button you clicked on, we would take a screenshot of that button.
So you'd have this sort of step-by-step trail of your actions. I see.
And then you could set it up into a test mode where they could go back and, like do an year end. So if you had like SAP or, JD Edwards, how many, people don't do a year end run. You do it once a year,
Right.
And so you could have this whole tutorial on how to do a year end run. And yes. You could step through it, and then you could, make sure that people knew what they were doing before they screwed up your year end.
Yeah.
It's interesting that there are no tools like that anymore. I don't know what's happened to that whole genre of software. I don't know whether it just got replaced with videos. And I don't know.
I guess it must, because I also did some of my initial training too, was also in like these, the whole set of sort of simulation environments that I had to build things and run them. And
But that taught me very early on, everything had to be dynamic.
Yes, because you're thinking differently about the user. It's like it's almost like user space. In some of these business apps, it's just like very narrow, right? Like a calculator almost. But the things that you're able to create these systems where the user space is quite wide, like like you said.
And then I went to, after that, we did that and we built that, which was quite a successful app. I then got involved in a product that had to spin up VMs, and the idea was that Microsoft had this idea. They wanted a user, instead of, if you were doing your, one of your Microsoft certifications, let's say for networking, you would actually get into a proper VM, and you'd have to go and configure the actual network on that VM, and then they would run software on the VM to verify that you had done it correctly.
Nice.
So that we're going to move away from multiple choice. So this was in about 2008, 2007.
I imagine, I think now that you say that, I remember towards the end of that project, you'd mentioned it, I imagine with Docker these days, they can do quite a lot of that, almost have pre-configured environments that are just scenarios where you load this up, fix this issue, and then if it runs, you're successful.
So for that, I had to build an app on the VM that ran PowerShell script, that the PowerShell script would then be used to verify what was going on the machine. So if you want to know where I learned PowerShell, that's where.
That makes sense. So that was sort of like the validator, the teacher. Okay.
And, so I had to build a designer where somebody could, put in, here comes the cat again, put in PowerShell script and set up all these scenarios. So again, nothing was fixed. All the software I've built has been this dynamic nature of configurations, and that's when I learned all about backend processing and logs and queues and all of threads and all of that stuff.
The tools that are available when you're thinking about this flexibility. Yeah.
And we got that all working, and then Microsoft, funny enough, Microsoft outsourced it, which I just never figured that out. And the guy they outsourced it to was a disaster. And so they canned the project. And then we sat with a fully working, brilliant product that just had no market. So that was really sad.
Yeah.
And
often happens in the software.
Yeah, man. But I learned so much about dynamics, about VMs, about, you know, backend pro, and then the product after that was to take SQL Server integration services. Is that what they call it? Which is the SQL Server in, kind of the ETL.
Yeah.
And write a front end, a web front end where they could go and configure the things and do all the mappings, and then it would then build the back end out and manipulate SQL Server, I think it's, yeah, integration services, and then run. So again, another dynamic back end processing. So that's literally been my whole career, has been these dynamic systems with back end processes.
Yeah,
So,
it's and I think you mentioned just a minute ago about how not every developer gets it, and I do think it has to do with, you know, the approach. It's like some people's minds don't think in systems; they just think in sort of linear processes. And if you're
yeah.
thinking as a developer in a linear process, you don't, none of these sort of things occur to you. You end up having to go back to the start all the time.
Yeah. And then you'll end up having this perfect code.
Yeah.
And then you kind of got to go back and then you start hacking it. And then you hack it. And then you hack it some more. And then you have 45 if statements. And then it's like, no.
And then these days you throw some AI at it and really mess it up.
Yeah. It's like, no, what you should have done is, you know, broken it up into processing units, into factories, into, you know, and I think also in the world of the modern world, I don't think object orientation is pushed enough.
Right. Yes. Yes.
And, you know, coming from that, well, Delphi in the beginning, we wrote STT in Delphi. And, you know, there you kind of have to, you have no freaking choice. Through to .NET, where you didn't absolutely have to, but it was, you know, and TypeScript. And all of those philosophies I've carried forward to TypeScript, and they still work and they still perform. And you've seen that they make life so much easier.
Yeah, it's sort of like primitives on a one higher level, right? You know, like you get the primitives that you learn, every programmer learns variables and loops and functions, right? But then there's a set of slightly advanced that I would still call them programming primitives, but you're right. You can get by so much with just using the simple blocks that some people never take on those more advanced ones. But as soon as those things click, and unfortunately, I think more and more developers who only know JavaScript, these things, it's almost like you have to be exposed to them for them to make sense to you. It's hard to discover them on your own.
Yeah, and also you've got to work in a big enough system.
Right. Yeah,
you know,
where these
also
things
one
make sense.
that's dynamic enough, that's not just, you know, present data in a grid, edit data, send back data to the back end. I mean, I look at sample code on the internet and I see people in the middle of their controllers making calls to the database. I'm like, oh, please, you never, ever, ever do that. It's like, you know, you should have layers. And it's like, drives me nuts. But it's all about this dynamic building frameworks, you know, isolating code and thinking abstractly about what you are trying to achieve. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, just one more thing too, just like taking it all the way from the abstract to the concrete, because you mentioned the value of it too around when you break it down, then you can see how am I going to be able to write a test for this? And that's also sort of a nice razor in this process of like, you know, when you can write a test for something, then you can actually move on technically and, you know, free yourself up to say, now I'm on to higher order things now.
And also, you don't have to worry about, is it going to break? And if it does break, you go back, you fix it, you add tests for that thing, that scenario you missed, and you carry on. But also, by breaking it out abstractly, you can go back to the client and ask questions on an abstract level. It's like, is this on an abstract level what you want to achieve?
Yes.
And they might go, ooh, yes, or Like, no, 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 and I think
Mhm.
there's a lot there that can help.
Yeah, just the analogy occurs to me. It's like, if a guy is just walking into a hardware store and he just needs a hammer, right? There's like a range of hammers he can get. What his, sort of vision, he might not need the one with the rubber grip and the claw. He might just need the one to hit. And many times it's the business owner isn't even thinking beyond, I just need that thing to hit. It's the process that reveals, well, actually, you need a rubber grip. You just didn't know it at the beginning. And
Yeah,
if you don't have the claw, it's going to really take a lot of time. And this is where I think that the collaborative nature, like you're advocating here, it's like you're building something that any user can take in any direction, but you also are letting the user guide the process, right?
yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
And if your initial pass of the UX isn't great, so what? It
Right,
doesn't
exactly.
matter.
Right. You put
It's
the rubber on later, right? You
Yeah,
don't need
yeah.
the rubber up front.
We know with CSS, and we know that's the thing about software is you can always go back and refine it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can
And that,
always go back and change it. If you've built it flexible enough from the beginning, then going back and making changes should not scare you.
no, because
If
it
it's
should be a malleable thing. Yeah.
Yeah, if it scares you, then you didn't do it correctly in the first place.
Yeah. Or it's somebody else's code that you have to change.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard horror stories of comments like, "This works, don't change it." It's like, no, you know, no,
Mhm.
just get rid of it.
Yes, yes, but those are the lessons of the road, right? The things you learn from being there and being bitten by it.
And I mean, this also comes down to things like with the Body app, we know we want to connect to certain APIs, and we
Yes,
know we want searchable lists. At this point in time, any list is good enough.
that's right.
We
Yep.
can refine that data over time. We can improve those things as we go. I mean, things that you should take into account upfront are performance issues because they're really difficult. I've had to go back
Mhm.
and fix performance issues. They're a
Yeah.
pain. So,
Yes.
like, performance is important. Um, getting something that's reasonably presentable because often clients get so fixated on the UX that they miss what it's actually doing. But
Sure.
enough to take it forward, and then you can present. But that's what I'm saying about refine the configuration. You can go and delete all the data in a table and put in more accurate data later. That's
Right.
never a problem.
Yep.
So yeah,
Yep. I like
this
that. And it
is
goes to the
how
build
I
verticals. Nice.
yeah, this is how I build.
Wow, thanks for breaking it down, Anton. And like you said, I have over the years that we worked together, I've seen this in action in a couple different places, and seeing it again the way you're approaching the Body app, and it has taught me a lot. It has saved me a lot of time. I'd say a lot of, especially the build vertical ones. Now, when I go and I do a lot of creative coding, little projects, and now it's normal for me to say like, what is the end-to-end minimum, and then I ramp it up from there. Where I didn't usually do that. Sometimes I would build a full UI that I was happy with before I even started looking at the back end.
And then you realize the back end
I,
was never going to handle the UI, and you're
exactly.
pissed with yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would mock a lot of things, in JSON files locally that wouldn't make any sense, but that was just my own lack of experience. I wasn't full stack back then.
Yeah, no, that does make a difference. And I've been pretty much full stack my whole life. So I'm
Yeah, well, you were
always
building the
thinking,
stack yourself back in Delphi, right?
oh,
Yes.
yeah, I can
Well,
tell
thank you.
stories of that. All
Thank you,
right, I think
Anton.
let's end it there, and
Yeah,
we'll carry on next week.
awesome. Thank you for the time.
It's a pleasure. Cheers.
Cheers.